You're listening to another ambitious entrepreneurnetwork.com podcast, the voice for entrepreneurs and small business. Now, onto the show.
Welcome to Industry Thought Leader Podcast. Stand out, be heard, influence. Want to influence real change with your message while become known as an authority in your field? Industry Thought Leader Podcast will show you how. Now, over to your host, Anne-Marie Cross.
Welcome to another episode of Industry Thought Leader Podcast. We've had some awesome guests today for those of you who are watching us on the streaming. And of course, today's guest on this show is also going to be sharing some awesome topics, especially around how to make leadership your legacy. But before we dive into that and introduce our guest, just a reminder for those of you who are interested in starting your own Thought Leader podcast, but you just don't know where to get started, the Podcasting with Purpose Immersive, this is a 90-day idea to launch your Thought Leader podcast, is starting soon. The doors are open. They will be closing soon. Pop over to podcastingwithpurpose.com/immersive to find out more. And of course, if you're listening or watching to the replay and the doors are closed, don't worry, pop yourself on the waiting list and you will be the first to know once a show goes live. All right, without further ado, let me introduce today's guest.
Hi, Anne-Marie. Hey, thanks for having me here.
How are you, Dave? Now, before we dive in, just let me share with everyone what you are going to talk about today and, of course, introduce who you are and the expertise that you'll bring to the show. So joining me today is Dave Carvajal. Dave says, make recruiting and culture your strategic competitive advantage and make leadership your legacy. Dave is a builder of billion-dollar businesses and he's the CEO of Dave Partners. He's a sought-out advisor and consultant to public company boards, venture capital investors and CEO entrepreneurs of some of the most exciting growth companies in tech. Now on today's show, Dave is going to share how to recruit like a jungle cat and create business leverage. He's going to talk about core values and how to make the right hires. I know many companies struggle with this. He's also going to talk about how to recruit like the greatest companies and hire the best people for your company. And as we know, our company is only as good as the team that runs it. So welcome to the show, Dave.
All right. Thanks for having me, Anne-Marie. I really appreciate you having me on as a guest. And I've been listening to your podcast for some time now. And so this is quite an honor for me to be here with you today.
Oh, and we're just as honored to hear you share your expertise. As I mentioned in the intro, hiring, recruiting the right staff in the right role is something that many business owners struggle with. And as we know, we're only as good as our team. And so I'm glad that you're speaking about this. How did you get into this industry? Was it something that you were always passionate about? Was it through own experience? Take us back along that journey. Give us a brief overview, if you would.
Yeah, great. So I've been thinking about recruiting, Anne-Marie, for 25 years now. The truth is I came from pretty humble beginnings. Yeah. My parents didn't have a lot of means. I put myself through college. I went down south for college. I came back to New York City and I just wanted to tear it up. And so immediately I took a job in the investment banking analyst program at Prudential. And I was on track to become a big investment banker. And, quite frankly, it took me a few years to realize they were all making a ton of money, which frankly at the time was very attractive to me. I discovered one of two things was also true. They were either absolutely miserable or they were the biggest jerks I'd ever met. Sometimes they were both. And so I decided early on in my career, I didn't want to be either one of those things. And I wasn't sure what I was going to do with my life. I ended up at the top recruiting firm in New York City. I never knew that the business of recruiting and headhunting had existed. And so when I got there, I said, wow, this is fantastic. They're going to find me a great job. Mm-hmm. Somehow I ended up speaking with the guy who started the company. He said, come work here as a headhunter, as a recruiter. I said, absolutely not. That's not even a real job. I ran the other way. As I was running towards the elevators, he literally tackled me. And he said, look, what's most important, especially early on in your career, is that you surround yourself by the best and the brightest people you could possibly find. He had 60 executive search folks from the top schools with vastly more experience than I had back then. And so I figured, maybe I could actually learn something here. He proceeded to explain to me that if I was willing to work hard, I could be really successful. At which point I said, look, stop right there. That sounds like a bunch of baloney. My dad would get up at 4 a.m. to come into the city to be a printer. For as long as I could remember, the glory of hard work was instilled in us as children. If what you're saying is true about hard work, can I meet your top 2 people? And so he proceeded to introduce me to them. What I wanted to figure out, Anne-Marie, was I wanted to figure out what they were doing to be successful.
Yes.
And I would just figure out whether I can do that or not. It turns out the way people were looking for jobs back then, this is like in the early 90s in New York City, the way people were looking for jobs was through these things called newspapers. And in New York is the New York Times, and that paper comes out at 6 a.m. on Sundays. And so literally it was a gut check as to whether I was willing to work that hard 6 days a week, starting at 6 a.m. on Sundays. I was 24 years old at the time. It turns out I was willing to work that hard. And so I said to the guy, if you hire me, I'm going to be the best guy in this office in 2 years. And so he hired me on the spot. I put my plan to work. I worked my tail off. And by 9 o'clock on Mondays, when everybody else was coming into the office for the first time after being away at the beach, I had already made 200 phone calls and logged my entire territory into the system. And so it literally took me 18 months to become the top guy in the office. And it was fantastic. I was young, single, living in Manhattan, making the kind of money I wanted to make finally. I never would have left if not for something much greater, much bigger. Of course, it was the mid-90s by then, and I was talking to technology guys all day long. And so it hit me that this internet thing was just going to change everything. And I had to be a part of it. And so, as luck would have it, that same guy, and back then, New York City technology really meant one thing, and that was finance. And so I was pulling the guy out of Merrill Lynch who had developed the fixed income trading desk using C++, Unix, and Sybase. And it was only because a week earlier, we'd picked up the same job order from Goldman Sachs, who needed a VP of fixed income trading technology, right? So doing that kind of horse trading all day, every day in the mid-90s, this internet thing I knew was going to be big because all that these technology guys wanted to talk to me about was whether I had jobs for them on this thing called the internet, right? And so as luck would have it, that same guy who started that recruiting firm and had asked me to join, he was the same guy that asked me to leave the company. And I was fortunate that he did because he was leaving and he asked me to come along with him. I was fortunate enough to be asked. And so we left to start a tiny little company called hotjobs.com. And the truth is, we didn't know what the heck we were doing. There were already 150 companies doing online recruitment. All we knew, or what we thought at least, was that because we were headhunters, we thought we could build a system for recruiting better than anyone else out there. And so we started doing it. I ended up running sales for the first year. I created a training program where I could take a kid right out of college and make them profitable to the company within 2.5 months. Wow. I showed this to the CEO. He and I made a pact that I would hire 2 salespeople for every 1 non-revenue producer. And then I proceeded to hire the first 500 people at Hot Jobs. I opened 8 offices around the country, and we had 500% revenue growth every single year. In 4 years, we took it from 400,000 to 96 million in revenues. We had 68% gross margins. And so it was a beautiful business.
Wow.
9/11 happened. The whole world changed. We had already taken the company public. It was a $1.2 billion market cap. 9/11 happened. The whole world changed. We had so much momentum. We actually continued to grow the business. We got it up to 125 million in revenues. The number 1 internet media company on the entire planet at that time was Yahoo.
Yeah.
And so in February of 2002, we ended up selling Hot Jobs to Yahoo. And it was fantastic. It was a glorious success in New York City. It was one of the bigger success stories. The truth is, after that, I was a little bit lost, actually. I didn't know what I was going to do with myself. And so I'd taken some time off. I went to the doctor 3 years later, and I was literally 60 pounds heavier than I am now. And I went to the doctor and he said, look, it's really bad. I was pre-diabetic. He said, you've got to start taking these drugs called statins because we've got to get your blood pressure, heart, cholesterol under control. And I said, look, respectfully, I don't want to touch those things. What does plan B look like? And he said this with a look of impossibility on his face. He said, well, you would have to lose some weight, get in shape, maybe eat some green things. I said, I can do that. Let's make that plan A from now on. And so that's when I decided to get healthy. And so I got healthy pretty fast. I discovered triathlons, and now I do Ironmans for fun.
Wow.
Like I'm doing my 5th Ironman in a week and a half here down in Florida.
Yeah.
And so then, to make a long story short, then what happened is I called up some guys that I'd hired at that first company. And I said, look, guys, I am never going to do this like not working thing again. I need to work. I need to produce.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go build something. Let's go do another company. And so we did exactly that. We started another business. That company, we were able to grow to about 400 people, 85 million in revenues. And by 2008, there we were again. It was the hottest game in town in New York City, one of the more successful internet tech companies in New York. And then after that, that was a good 5-year run there. Around 2009, I decided I didn't want to do this anymore for one company. I wanted to help as many as I could. And really what happened, Anne-Marie, is I kind of found my calling. I'd done some work with this guy that I'm sure you're well familiar with, a gentleman by the name of Tony Robbins. The guy with the big T.
I have heard from him.
And so I did coaching with him at the highest levels. I've been to India with him twice. And he really kind of had a profound impact on my life. And what I decided, what I realized was that, I had developed this unique set of skills that happen to be valuable to entrepreneurs who want to build billion-dollar businesses. Mm-hmm. And I love doing that. And I want to continue to do that. But I want to do that so that I can really fulfill on the other extreme this thing that had become my calling and a mission, which was to help promote literacy, education, and gender equality around the developing world. And so I partnered with a guy named John Wood from an organization called Room to Read. And in fact, I wrote a book that came out last year, and 100% of the profits from the book are going to Room to Read. And John was good enough to write the foreword to my book. Really kind of have connected over the past few years, and he's a great guy. And that's basically what I've been doing for the last 10 years is I generally get brought in by the chairman of the board, somebody at the board level who writes a big check. Usually it's 20, 40, $50 million into a high growth company. And they ask my team and I to help build the boards and the executive teams of those companies.
Yes.
And so in the last, 10, I've been thinking about recruiting for 25 years, having built companies with my own hands as an entrepreneur, as an executive operator, and also as a service provider to investors and boards and CEOs that are building some of these hot technology companies coming out of New York City.
Yeah, amazing. And, as you have shared that story, one of the things I'm sure that has been time and time again proven as being so very important is what we've said, to have the right team in the right place. And the fact that you said you created a training back then where, you would get someone up to top contributor or really contributing to the company within a short amount of time, because statistic wise, it takes a lot longer, especially if they're younger. What were some of the key aspects of what you were doing or what you've implemented that you can look back on and say, look, these are some of the key elements? And I'm sure this really speaks into some of the things you want to talk about today. What were some of the key aspects within that training that enabled those young people to join and become productive so much quicker?
Yeah, I love it. Look, at the end of the day, the three most important things that a leader does, that any business does, I think this is one of the greatest challenges for businesses, is to get alignment around these three things: a common purpose, shared values, clear objectives. And that is the role of a leader, is to create alignment on those three things: a common purpose, shared values, and clear objectives. And what I've seen, Anne-Marie, the biggest differentiator between leaders who have enormous success and those that don't is their ability to recruit and build culture. And the beautiful thing, the great news is that recruiting is actually a leadership competency. I think that everything bad that happens at a company is fundamentally a people problem.
Yes.
But on the flip side, I also think that recruiting is the greatest opportunity of any entrepreneur.
Yes.
Recruitment of the right people represents the greatest opportunity of any entrepreneur, and it's also the leading cause for failure. Yes. And so I actually believe that there is an A+ player for every role in every company, and every CEO should know this. And on page 97 of my book, I outline a 1-page blueprint. And I cannot emphasize enough the importance of getting clarity. Clarity is power. Getting clarity of mind on what the target looks like. Who is it that we're going to hire? I've had this conversation with some of the top venture capital investors in the United States. And by the end of the conversation, they said to me, Anne-Marie, Dave, you are correct. You are actually right. I secede the point. You are correct. And what I've said to them is I say, look, Fred, you are sometimes doing more damage than you are good when you say to an entrepreneur, here's a resume of a great CFO. Because any two reasonably intelligent people could look at a resume and say, wow, this is a great CFO. But that's not the task at hand. The challenge, the task at hand is this a great CFO for us?
Yes.
Those two little words, for us, change everything, because then it's about a process of defining, first and foremost, who we are as a company, as a culture, as the values that we hold at the highest regard.
Yes.
What our mission is, right? So it forces us to really define who we are, but then also get clarity on the role and get clarity on who we're looking for. And that's why I say that I think one of the most important things to do when you do this incredibly important function at any company called the recruiting and hiring is that first and foremost, you have to create a blueprint. You have to create clarity, and you have to create clarity around those three things that are the most important in business: a common purpose, shared values, and clear objectives.
Yeah. Do you think even though organizations may be aware of it, they're still struggling to define that, or they may think that they have defined it, but it's not nearly enough clear to define because it's still not attracting the right people and around that common purpose? Are we getting it right, or do we still have a long way to go?
Look, I do believe that there is an epidemic crisis of bad hiring out there. Look, at the same time, I will say that no leader is perfect and no one has a perfect record. But I will say this: all recruiting and hiring is fundamentally about people. And the challenge is, they've actually done studies across any number of topics where they've done kind of blind tests, and the average person thinks that they have above average intelligence on any number of things. And there are 7 different types of intelligences, right? One of the exercises that I do with my CEOs, with my client partners is, and this is a very important exercise because it's not only is it a good measure of humility, which we can talk more about that, but I'm very big on this idea of humility. I think it's the opposite of humility, called hubris, which gets companies and entrepreneurs and CEOs into a whole lot of trouble, right? And I think that when you use your gut, I think entirely too many people that are doing the recruiting and the hiring are going by their gut feeling. And I say, don't go by your gut, because the data that we have on the most profound of human relationships is that about half the marriages will fail. And that's about the same track record that people have when it comes to recruiting and hiring, is about 50%. And what I'm imploring people to do is to learn how to have a recruiting conversation so that you can get better. Because recruiting is a leadership competency, you can get better at it.
Yes.
But you have to study leadership as a student. You have to be a student of leadership. And recruitment is a leadership competency. And so only by really kind of becoming a student of recruitment, of leadership, can you increase your chances from 50% to 90%. And I think that's the name of the game.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so true. One of the things that I have often heard from people who were being recruited into an organization. One of the things that would often occur, sadly, more often than not, was that the job itself was not clearly defined. And that's one of the most debilitating things for someone that's just joining a company. If you don't know what the process are or what the expectations are, if it's not clearly communicated, it's very difficult do a job well done if you don't know what that job is, and this, the goalposts continue to change. Have you found that that also is an area that people struggle with, because they know that they need someone, because often, especially for entrepreneurs who are perhaps growing their business and maybe at a stage where they're still doing a lot themselves, they know that their time is limited. Got to hire someone, bring someone in, are not clearly communicating, and then both people end up not doing the job well at all. So do you find also the clarification of the role itself is something that is not clear enough as well from business point of view? Yeah.
Absolutely. Look, Anne-Marie, I think you've very clearly articulated the reason why bad hiring is at an epidemic crisis level. Right. I think that, entirely too many people with professional responsibility are winging it.
Yes.
They're just shooting from the hip. They're using their gut. And I think that causes a whole lot of human pain and suffering. I think it's painful for the companies and for the person. And oftentimes, to make matters worse, hiring managers are reluctant to admit that they were wrong, that they made a bad hire. And so then they'll keep on a bad hire, for far too long.
Try everything.
Everything. And both sides of the relationship, it's just an awful experience. And so let me add some kind of a positivity on this conversation, because look, I've spent entirely too much time with people that were experiencing this pain and suffering, right? And look, what I say is, you can do your own taxes, you can do your own haircuts, you can even do your own dentistry. But oftentimes the thing that will cause you the skull-crushing pain, suffering, and brain damage is doing your own hiring. I think that you've either got to learn how to actually have a recruiting and hiring conversation and get really good at doing this, or you need to work with someone. You need to hire someone who knows how to do this stuff. Right. And so, but let me give you a little bit of perspective on some of the work that I do with my clients that I think would be tremendously useful to this audience. Number one, the first thing that I do, one of the exercises that I do is I take entrepreneurs 10 years out. I take them through a process called organizational self-determination. And I have the CEO really envision and visualize what maximum success would look like for his business, for his enterprise or her enterprise 10 years from now. What does that look like in terms of top line revenues, in terms of profit margin, in terms of what truths about the marketplace? We're going to be the number one player in this market or in this region, or we're going to be an entrant in this other category. These kinds of things, right? And you don't have to get super detailed, but give me the high level points of what that 10-year destination looks like. Once I have that, then I can reverse engineer and I can then bring them a little bit closer and see what that looks like at 3 years. Then I can do that at 1 year. What do we want this business to look like? What are the strategic priorities for this executive team? Why are we getting out of bed in the morning to come into the office to work, to do this? What are the 3 or 4 strategic priorities that we want as a business over the next 12 months? Yes. Once I get clear on that, on those strategic priorities, then we can get clear on what does this person need to do to help us achieve those priorities? What does success look like for her? What will she get to accomplish as a CFO in our organization, right? So my blueprint has 3 parts: a top, a middle, and a bottom section. The top section is about the company. So it's about the culture, the values, and the mission of the organization. And sometimes I spend 4 hours with an executive team just getting clarity on that. Because if the CEO thinks they're going to be a $10 billion company, but the CFO thinks they're going to be a $1 billion company, that's a huge gap, right?
There's a disconnect there somewhere. Yeah.
Right. So we get clear on the company, culture, vision, culture, values, mission. The middle part is about the role. The bottom part is about the candidate. In the role, it has 3 columns. And I start with the right-hand side because I like to begin with the end in mind. And I reverse engineer that, right? So we get clarity on those strategic priorities. What are the top 3 or 4 things that we're looking to do as an executive team? Number 1. Number 2, what does success look like for this new executive that we're going to hire? right? What will they get to accomplish? Only by getting clarity on those two things, on the strategic priorities, the success factors, can we then get clarity on the third thing, which is probably the most important part for me, which is what are the core competencies then necessary for this person to be successful in their role. But now, because we've also done the top part about the culture, the values, the mission, not only are they going to be successful in their role, but they're going to help us achieve our mission. Right. And then the bottom part is simply the top 3 or 4 things that are the must-haves and the nice-to-haves. And just getting that clarity of thought, it usually takes about 30 to 45 minutes sitting down with the CEO, asking the right questions and filling out that blueprint. Now we've got a target. Now we can actually hit the target. And that exercise needs to be done before the very first interview. And because, what most entrepreneurs do, what most hiring managers do is they need an accountant. So they just start interviewing accountants, and they might interview 5 or 6 of them and choose the best one and actually hire the best one and still only be at 60% of what they need.
Yes.
When you create a blueprint, the people that you invite in for an interview at a minimum are going to already have 100% of the technical needs that you require for the role. And then you can assess on the most important thing, which is culture fit.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. That whole topic around culture fit and also expectations of the environment. And I would love your feedback, being that you've had so much extensive experience, especially around human behavior, I think, and how one particular person may have exactly the same technical expertise as someone else, yet their characteristics, their mannerisms are quite different. And it's around the topic of entrepreneurship and intrapreneurship. That's kind of a word that we're talking about as well, especially going into 2020, because I've seen some people that have been working within an organization who is very much more an entrepreneur. They're innovative. They love to try new things, whether it be around process or whatever it might be. But because the environment in which they're working is not as progressive or it's not as quick, they think, well, I'm going to start my own business. But they're not actually they would rather sit underneath within still a structure. So we've got some incredible entrepreneurs who could support entrepreneurial businesses, entrepreneurs. But then you've got entrepreneurs who are looking for an entrepreneur, but as you know, and so I'd love you're smiling and nodding, so you know what I'm getting at, because this is a conversation that things that I've observed, and share a little bit more about that and you're experiencing that, because that makes the attitude and that's so important as how they are operating in the environment. Yes.
Yeah. Look, this is a great topic, right? And I think it's really at the intersection of the difference between core values and core competencies, right? And so, I think one of the most powerful exercises that a CEO can do with his executive team is to do an inventory of not only kind of behavioral and personality, but communication styles as well, right? One of the exercises that I take our client partners through is this idea that there is no perfect leader. And it's not about trying to be the perfect leader. Rather, and the first set of questions revolves around this notion that there are 7 different types of intelligences. And surely, Anne-Marie, there are 1 or 2 of those intelligences that you are particularly strong at.
Yes.
And conversely, there might be 1 or 2 that you're not the world's greatest at. And if you can get comfortable with that idea, then we can actually begin to build a team that complements each other.
Yes.
And I think that is a very powerful exercise to really understand the dynamics of what a great leader does is actually puts together a very strong, cohesive team of executives that complements each other.
Yes.
Right. So I'm a fan of all of these kind of personality assessments and behavioral assessments. Some of my favorite include Jack Welch, who was kind of a legendary CEO for General Electric Company. He would take his entire executive leadership team, which was about like the top 20% of the company. He would take to a leadership development camp in Croton, New York, and they worked with a gentleman by the name of Dr. Herman. and they did an exercise called the HBDI, Herman Brain Dominance Indicator. And it essentially kind of divides the brain into 4 quadrants, and it maps out where you generally operate under conditions of low stress and how you operate under conditions of high stress.
Yes.
And the purpose of the exercise really is to understand yourself first and foremost, but then also understand how you relate to your team members. And it's also a very powerful tool in how to build the construct of the most, capable executive team.
Yeah.
Right. So, for example, if your CFO is very lacks visionary capability, which might be a very good thing in a CFO, you don't want them getting super creative with the numbers, right? But you might need them to be very process oriented.
Yes.
Right. And whereas maybe your chief marketing officer or your person who's developing the product development, they might need to be very visionary.
Yes.
Right. And so understanding these things and doing kind of an inventory of your different executives, of the different team members can really help not only to at the beginning of putting together the team, but then also can help kind of grease the social wheels so that the team can actually perform and work better together as well.
Yeah. So true. I mean, we've only just scratched the surface, but I remember years ago, because I come from the career industry. So some of the assessments that you talked about, I had to learn because we got certified in it. But one of I think one of the greatest gifts that you can give yourself is to become aware of what makes you tick, what environments you do your best work in, how best you communicate and absorb, and others as well. Because I think when we have an appreciation of ourselves and others, how they communicate, we can become far more influential because we just adapt our communication styles to build rapport. And then that's how we can work together. And I think a lot of times people are communicating, but they're miscommunicating because they don't understand how best to communicate with that other person. But we've just scratched the surface. But however, what you've provided today has been valuable, I know for sure, for many. So what is the best way for them to connect? You mentioned that you've captured a lot of what you've been sharing in a great book resource, but by the sounds of it, needs to be on every leader's bookshelf. So share more. How can people connect and find out more about the work you do?
So davecarvajal.com is our website. And I think you can find everything there.
Yeah.
My company is Dave Partners. And there's information there about the book and some giveaways as well.
Yeah. One of the questions that I love to ask people when they're thinking forward, and we're nearing at 2020, when we're thinking about the change that we know that many businesses are now having to deal with because of social media. We've heard the word digital disruption, and you've come, from companies in tech. As leaders, I think, in a lot of those industries which are continuing to change, we need to be able to adapt and change. Same with the workforce, aren't we? I mean, the workforce here in Australia, we're talking about more contract roles. And I think, the gig economy, those are also words that we're throwing around. From organisation point of view, thinking of 2020 and beyond, what are some of the things leaders as business, no matter what size that they're at, they need to be aware of and mindful of? Because if they're not, even with recruiting the right people, that they're still not going to be working at that top level that we know that they want. What do they have to be aware of as change moving into the future?
Yeah. Look, I'm a big fan of, I read quite a lot. I was able to actually take in 57 books last year.
Wow.
And two, actually one of my favorites is by a gentleman named Peter Diamandis. And he's written 2 books actually that are quite spectacular about this, technological change, and it's actually accelerating. And I think what the best leaders do is you don't wish for things to be easier. You wish to be stronger. You wish to be better. I think embracing technology as it unfolds before us, getting ahead of the curve, learning how to actually use, I've got 16-year-old twin boys, right? And so I find myself increasingly doing as much as I can to learn from them, to understand what tools and platforms they're using, and to get comfortable with them and be, kind of ahead of the curve. And I think that's, both the reality, but I think it's also a wonderful opportunity.
I think so. One of the things that you said, and I think this beautifully relates to this, is as leaders, we often assume that we need to know everything. But the moment that we can be vulnerable and say, I don't need to know everything, but what I do know is I want to bring and surround myself with people who know. They have, as you've said, understand where your strengths are and maybe your weaknesses. Hire for your weaknesses, get a good team around you, and allow them to, or collaborate to the common good, knowing the culture and the vision and the mission. I think that's fantastic. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on the show, Dave. I loved our conversation. Please connect with Dave, get a copy of his book, because moving forward, I think, as he said, your team is going to be what you need to really support. You want to make sure you recruit the right person in the right role. And for a rapidly changing marketplace, we want to make sure that who we do hire are the top recruits to support our businesses in developing our business. So thanks once again for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much, Henry. Thanks for having me.